Connie Kritzberg was a reporter for the Dallas Times-Herald on November 22, 1963. A couple of hours after the assassination, she did a phone interview with two of the principal doctors who had tended Kennedy.
I talked to Dr. Kim Clark, who was head of neurosurgery at Parkland Hospital, and Dr. Malcolm Perry. So I asked, how many wounds were there in the president? And I was told Dr. Kim Clark said there was a gaping wound in the back of the head. And Dr. Perry said the wound I was working on was an entrance wound in the neck. And I asked him where it was located. I asked him, was it below the Adam's apple? He said, yes, it was in the midline, in the front of the neck, below the Adam's apple. And he said 3 times that it was an entrance wound from the front. And so I wrote a very simple story, only about 12 inches long as we measured stories, and turned it in.
The next morning, Connie found the story she filed had changed.
I found in the story, in about the 3rd paragraph, there had been a very unprofessional sentence inserted. It said, a doctor admitted there was possibly 1 wound. So I was very upset. I called the city desk and I talked to one of the assistant city editors whom I respected quite a bit, and I said, who changed my story? Who put in that sentence? And he immediately knew what I was talking about. He said, the FBI. A story couldn't be printed that there was more than 1 shot and that 1 came from the front. It had to be altered, no matter how crudely, to conform to the official story that there were 3 shots from 1 place, from 1 man, and it was only 1 man who committed the murder.
Confirmation of what Connie was told by Dr. Perry comes from one of his colleagues who also attended the fatally wounded president at Parkland Hospital, the late Dr. Charles Crenshaw.
Prior to the tracheostomy performed by Dr. Perry, I observed in the lower third of the neck a small, rounded, well-demarcated entrance wound. This was obliterated by the tracheostomy in that Dr. Perry made the tracheostomy incision through the entrance wound. Different parts of the tissues were spread. He then made the incision into the trachea, and through the hole that had previously been made by the entrance of the bullet, the tracheostomy was put in place.
Radio reports from Dallas that afternoon mentioned the small round wound of entry in the front of the president's neck. They were heard by the late Dr. Robert Livingston, who was then scientific director of the National Institute for Mental Health.
The reports had been that the president had been shot from the rear, from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building. And the evidence at hand from the Parkland Hospital doctors of a small, neat wound in the neck was contradictory to that, or at least complementary to that, in the sense that it required that there be a shot from in front, so that if he were shot from the rear, he was also being shot at the same time from in front. So I wanted to tell whoever was going to do the autopsy about that, and so I telephoned Bethesda Naval Hospital. The officer of the day I knew, and he put me quickly through to Dr. James Humes, who was going to head the autopsy team. He was very cordial, and we had a good conversation, brief. He had not heard about the neck wound. I told him that it was important because it was a wound of entrance, and I told him that it should be explored completely for its track and to find any bullet or fragments of bullets that would remain, and particularly emphasized that it had to be a frontal wound since there was no tearing of the tissues. He left the telephone momentarily and came back and said, Dr. Livingston, I'm sorry, I can't continue this conversation. The FBI won't let me.
Humes later claimed he only learnt about that bullet wound after the autopsy from one of the Dallas doctors. he never examined it.
I'm absolutely certain about that telephone call. I'm sure that Dr. Humes got a clear impression from me about the neck wound representing a wound of entrance.
At Parkland Hospital after the president's death, the media were reporting that the fatal shots had come from in front of the presidential car.
A press conference was conducted by Acting Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff at 1:30 after the president had been pronounced dead at 1 o'clock. Malcolm Kilduff explained that it had been a simple matter of a bullet right through the head while pointing to his right temple and attributing that finding to Admiral George Berkeley, who was the president's personal physician. This wound to the right temple and another wound to the throat, 3 different times described as a wound of entry, were widely broadcast on radio and television that afternoon. They were quickly suppressed because, of course, they contradicted the official government account, which was that 3 shots had been fired, all of them from above and behind.
The headshot seemed to come from the right front. It seemed to strike him here, and his head went back.
And then as the car got directly in front of us, well, a gunshot apparently from behind us hit the president in the side of the temple.
Then when the second shot came, I looked back just in time to see the president struck in the face by the second bullet.
Where I thought the shots came from was the picket fence area and around that large tree.
A shot come right past my left ear, and that meant it would have had to come from this direction.
The bullet struck about where and passed about where?
From here
Right.
through.
Actually, the shot was in the temple, exited here.
Temple, hit the temple.
Yeah.
Got it.
And right a little bit above and in front of the ear, right in the hairline.
They had a picture of Kennedy laying on the table, and it was a front profile, if you will, or front view. And the only thing we saw was a little hole about here in the temple. And then, and another photograph, or another slide that Bill had, showed a huge gaping hole here in the back. And so Bill and I logically assumed that the wound was a frontal entry wound.
A few days after the assassination, I was at the White House in the press room, and Knudsen came to me, and he said, Joe, I have something I want to show you. So I went back to his sort of a workroom, and he pulled out an envelope and showed me about 12 pictures, 5 by 7, and had all these pictures of the president on his stomach and on his back, and could see the hole here, about 3/8 of an inch, and the back of his head above the line, big hole about the size of a grapefruit. And then a couple days later, maybe a day later, he said, Joe, have a minute? And I said, sure. He said, I want to show you something. Those pictures I showed you the other day, these are the same ones, but a little different. And I said, what do you mean? He said, let me show you. He got the first one out, and I said, no hole. He said, no, they covered it up. And I looked in the back. The hole was neatly covered up. And I said, who did that? He said, well, I didn't do it. I said, well, I'm not saying you did, but I'm surprised.
There is no record of Robert Knudsen attending Kennedy's autopsy, yet he had photographs in his possession that had clearly been altered to disguise a shot from the front.
These photographs were always in the control of the Secret Service. So whoever changed this, whoever modified it, either had to be in the government or had to have the approval of the government to do this. We certainly can't imagine the Mafia, for example, doing this, or the Soviets. There's just no way. It had to be someone with government approval.